"I will go," she whispered, stepping over the threshold into the dark where the eyes of the married waited. The crushing gravity of the ancient entity struck her chest like a physical blow, forcing her to her knees in the dust. She could hear the heavy, unnatural breathing of the guardian, a sound that vibrated through the marrow of her bones. Terror eclipsed her greed for a fleeting second, and she scrambled backwards out of the wing of silence, gasping for air. Behind her, the rogue sorcerer Bujema was already betraying their unholy pact, his greed overriding his fear. While Aicha was paralyzed, he had secretly snatched a heavy gold coin from the threshold, slipping it into his rags. He did not know that the gold of the Mansour vault was spiritually tethered to the demons that guarded it. As Bujema turned to flee down the corridor, the shadows on the walls suddenly detached themselves from the plaster. The temperature in the hallway plummeted to freezing, and the oil lamps extinguished themselves in a suffocating wave of black mist. A massive, invisible hand, burning with the scorching heat of smokeless fire, clamped around the sorcerer's throat. Bujema was lifted entirely off the ground, his feet kicking frantically in the empty air as he choked on his own terror. The darkness materialized into the towering horned silhouette of an Ifrit, its eyes glowing like dying embers in a forge. "Thief of the ash," the demon hissed, a voice that sounded like grinding tombstones and rattling chains. Lala Aicha watched in mute horror as the entity squeezed, the sickening crunch of Bujema's neck echoing through the Kasbah. The sorcerer's body was violently pulled straight down into the solid stone floor, merging with the architecture in a grotesque display of alchemical binding. Only his blood remained, pooling on the cold mosaics, a grim warning that the vault accepted no amateur thieves. Lala Aicha had survived the encounter, but the psychological rot of the red mercury had firmly rooted itself in her mind. She realized that the local warlocks of Morocco were nothing but pathetic charlatans playing with forces beyond their comprehension. They were feast eaters who would perform cheap tricks, gorge themselves on her food, and flee at the first cold draft. Her obsession became a bottomless chasm, draining her vast fortune as she chased the mirage of ultimate demonic power. Desperation drove her to look beyond the borders, seeking a master whose soul was already forfeit to the abyss. Word reached her of a legendary grand sorcerer from the deep shadowed jungles of Mali, a man who commanded the dead. The Malian warlock demanded an astronomical price, arriving in Morocco on a private jet paid for by her dwindling reserves. He walked into the Kasbah carrying an aura of blood-soaked authority, surrounded by a suffocating smell of copper and decay. Accompanied by two silent disciples, he bypassed the formalities and marched straight toward the sealed, cursed corridor. He began his incantations, speaking a forgotten, guttural dialect that made the ancient stones of the courtyard bleed a black sap. But the Marid of the Al-Mansour estate bowed to no mortal magic, recognizing the intruder as prey rather than a master. Less than an hour after the warlock entered the dark, the fortress shook with a terrifying, subterranean roar. An agonizing scream tore through the silence, a sound of absolute human despair that made the servants cover their ears in horror. The grand sorcerer was violently ejected from the dark doorway, his body thrown through the air like a discarded rag doll. He crashed on the mosaic floor of the courtyard, his flesh slashed to ribbons by unseen, razor-sharp demonic claws. His clothes were soaked in his own blood, and his eyes were wide with a madness born of seeing true, unfiltered hell. Lala Aicha watched in paralyzed horror as the disciples dragged their broken master away, fleeing the cursed grounds forever. The old servant, Kadur, recognizing that the Kasbah was consuming them all, secretly placed a call across the ocean. He contacted Aicha's son, Dries, who had built a sterile, modern life in America, far away from the bloodlines of magic. Dries returned to Morocco out of pity, bringing his pregnant wife into a home that felt colder than an open grave. Lala Aicha sat him down in the dim light, confessing the terrifying truth of the vault and the empire of wealth it contained. Dries, blinded by Western logic and arrogant disbelief, scoffed at her tales of jinn, curses, and shape-shifting sentinels. He saw only a vast inheritance waiting to be unearthed, a physical obstacle that could be solved with modern tools and a tough foreman. Dismissing his mother's frantic warnings, Dries agreed to drive down the treacherous coastal roads to Safi to fetch a specialized contractor. But the spirits of the Kasbah do not allow the arrogant to move freely. The Ifrit reached out across the winding highway. A sudden, inexplicable shadow enveloped his car, sending it violently spiraling off the cliffside in a horrific symphony of crushing metal. The catastrophic crash obliterated their vehicle, stealing the life of his pregnant wife in an instant of devastating cruelty. Dries was pulled from the mangled wreckage, clinging to life through a thread, plunged into a deep, agonizing coma. He lay in a hospital bed for 2 grueling months, his mind trapped in a dark abyss while his body fought to breathe. The tragic news brought a distant cousin to the Kasbah to mourn, a greedy man who had always envied the Mansour wealth.
Ignoring the weeping of the household, the cousin's thoughts fixated entirely on the forbidden wing of silence. Under the cloak of midnight, he crept toward the vault, armed with nothing but a flashlight and foolish ambition. He did not know that the darkness housed a Sealat, a master of illusion that punished trespassers with agonizing precision. By the time the morning call to prayer echoed over the mountains, the estate was once again plunged into chaotic screaming. Kadur found the cousin's lifeless body sprawled in the dust near the threshold, his face contorted in a mask of sheer agony. He had been struck in the neck by a massive serpent, a venomous manifestation of the demonic guardian that melted his veins. The back-to-back tragedies finally broke the remaining illusion of safety, prompting Kenza, Aicha's daughter, to arrive from France. Kenza took one look at the spiritual carnage and demanded an immediate evacuation from the cursed ancestral home. She forced her mother to abandon the Kasbah, locking its heavy wooden doors and leaving the demons to rule the empty halls. They relocated to a much smaller secondary estate miles away, a modest house that felt humiliating to the once proud widow. Lala Aicha was now practically destitute, her vast fortune swallowed by the charlatans and the medical bills for her comatose son. When Dries finally awoke from his coma, the man who returned was a hollow shell, entirely devoid of human sanity. The trauma and the ancestral curse had opened his mind to a heavy Tsar possession, breaking his psychological foundation. He regressed into a feral state, refusing to sleep indoors, his eyes glazed over with a terrifying, vacant stare. Every night, Dries would wander into the dense woods, returning at dawn, covered in mud, speaking in whispers to invisible entities. Lala Aicha wept tears of pure dread, trapped in a nightmare where her son was a ghoul and her wealth was a memory. Yet, the insidious poison of the red mercury still pulsed relentlessly in her heart, refusing to let her accept defeat. A wandering rogue sorcerer visited their new small estate, a man with calculating eyes who sensed her desperate vulnerability. He whispered that this modest ground too held a buried secret, a forgotten cache left by her tyrannical grandfather. He performed a theatrical ritual in the courtyard, unearthing a small, rotting wooden box from the shallow dirt. Inside lay a pitiful handful of gold coins and a tiny glass vial containing exactly 3 grams of red mercury. The rogue sorcerer claimed his share of the gold and vanished, leaving Aicha staring at the glowing crimson liquid. She knew 3 grams were not enough to buy the world, but they were the exact requirement for the ultimate forbidden alchemy. She sought out a high-ranking warlock from Qatar, a master of Tanzil, the dark alchemical art of summoning demonic wealth. The Qatari warlock agreed to the blasphemous trade, arriving in Morocco to negotiate a pact with the unseen kings. He demanded a ritually pure environment, setting up an altar of incense and esoteric symbols in the heart of her living room. On the 3rd night of heavy rhythmic incantations, the atmosphere grew suffocatingly thick, and the temperature plummeted. The warlock entered a deep trance, negotiating with the shadows, trading the drops of mercury for an ocean of foreign currency. The laws of reality began to warp. The ceiling of the room seemed to dissolve into an infinite black void. Suddenly, bundles of crisp, unearthly dollars and euros began to rain down from the sky like a torrential downpour. Lala Aicha watched in hypnotic, heart-pounding awe as the floor vanished beneath a growing mountain of manifested riches. The smell of the phantom money was intoxicating, a scent of fresh ink mixed with the unmistakable stench of the grave. But fate is a cruel architect, and the tragic madness of Dries proved to be the undoing of this dark miracle. Clad in filthy rags and covered in forest soil, the feral son wandered aimlessly into the chamber of the ritual. He stared at the raining money, his broken mind momentarily piercing the veil of the demonic illusion surrounding them. "Infidels!" Dries screamed, his voice carrying a pure, devastating resonance that shattered the unholy frequency of the room. The Qatari warlock gasped in sheer terror as the spiritual connection violently collapsed, plunging the room into chaos. The mountains of money instantly dissolved, turning into piles of gray, suffocating ash that coated their skin in death. The vial of red mercury evaporated into thin air, reclaimed by the unseen entities in a cruel twist of supernatural mockery. It was in the bleak aftermath of this profound defeat that I, a humble chronicler of these dark histories, visited the estate. I arrived alongside Sheikh Othman, a man of pure faith who wielded no dark arts, seeking only to banish the lingering shadows. The Sheikh did not hesitate when the Pharaoh Dries approached. He raised his hands and recited ancient verses of divine protection. The Tsar spirit within Dries shrieked, violently thrashing the man's body against the floor before fleeing the host entirely. Sheikh Othman then turned to Aicha, revealing that the rogue sorcerers had used demonic teleportation to steal her remaining gold. He warned her that the ancient Kasbah was now entirely lost, its doors breached from the inside by an army of the damned. A colossal blue djinn, a devastating entity of azure flame and pure malice, had awakened to command the restless Marid. This monstrous blue demon now roamed the ancestral grounds, physically crushing any foolish treasure hunters into unrecognizable pulp. The skies above the Atlas Mountains grew dark as the blue djinn began amassing an army of night terrors, threatening to spill into the mortal world. Sheikh Othman looked at the horizon with profound dread, realizing that normal prayers and minor exorcisms would no longer hold the line. They needed to find a tall man named Rashid, a hidden ascetic who dwelt in the sprawling, chaotic heart of Casablanca. Rashid alone possessed the supreme, blinding light of God's word, a divine resonance capable of incinerating demons to ash. It was the sword of heaven, the only human who could walk into the Kasbah of the Black Wind,
and silence the blue jinn forever. The true war for the souls of Morocco was no longer about buried gold. It was a crusade of supreme light against absolute darkness.